I love the art of cards. Now, I'm not talking about the art on cards in general, although that's fine. I'm talking about the art of making a card in a game, of creating a single piece of cardboard that has mechanics and lore on it that tells a cohesive story of what is happening in a game. I don't think enough people talk about that. They tend to talk about games in general. I want to talk about cards in specific and what kind of things make a card good or make a card bad or inconsistent. I have a lot of opinions on this and nobody talks about it, so I'm going to be talking about it in the context of The Shores of Tripoli, which is an excellent game that I really like, with some really good cards and some uh, pretty bad cards. But we'll be going through every single card in Shores of Tripoli. Now, when talking about cards, it's important to distinguish between when you're talking about whether a card is good in terms of lore and whether or not it's good in terms of mechanic. A lot of these cards are really good in one and bad in the other, or bad in one and good in the other. Some are good in both, some are bad in both. So, starting with, let's talk about Thomas Jefferson. So, Thomas Jefferson and the corresponding Tripolitanian card in uh, the that the Tripoli has, they're sort of unique in that all they are what I call noun cards. Now, a noun card is where the card just says a thing. This is the name of a person. Whereas if you compare it to, say, Bainbridge Supplies Intel, this is a verb card where it's describing an action that's happening, or Hammett recruits Bedouins, as opposed to, say, Tribute Paid, which is a noun card. Um, or Launch the Intrepid is a verb card. These are inconsistencies. You don't necessarily have to be consistent in your naming conventions when it comes to cards. Um, I actually really like what Shores of Tripoli does here in general, where it gives various adjectives or specific nouns or verbs associated with something that the character or the historical figure did in order to better communicate here. Hey, this is what this person did. Preble's boys take aim. This is really interesting because it's not actually just talking about Preble. It's talking about his people who worked under him who were referred to as Preble's boys, and that's actually a common term that was known of it at the time. With Thomas Jefferson, it's just his name. Now, normally I would be harshing on this card for inconsistency. It's like, why don't you name it Thomas Jefferson inspires America, or Thomas Jefferson mandates action, or some sort of verb. But because you basically play as Thomas Jefferson in this, it seems weird to narrow it down to just a single action because it's kind of like Jefferson did everything in terms of the action taking in this conflict, and similar to Yusef Koromanli. In that sense, a more consistent naming convention would be naming this card the presidency or the office of the presidency, because it's weird for someone who's playing as a character to just have a card that represents their character, whereas in reality this represents the office of the presidency. But um, it's fine. It's not really a problem. It really certainly not a significant one. As far as the effect, it's a good effect. I'm not really going to talk about that. Let's talk about Swedish frigates arrive. So I do have problems with this card in terms of lore. Mechanics is actually really good. I actually really like the design of Swedish frigates arrive, specifically in how it interacts with Sweden pays tribute, because there's a legitimate strategy to not bringing the Swedes in, and thus the Tripolitanians can't play the card where they make the Swedes go away and get money out of it. But that means you don't get the Swedes for the whole game. Do you want to? Do you want to not? Honestly, it's an interesting choice. I've seen very good strategies that use both. Very well designed card. The reason I don't like the name Swedish frigates arrive is that it implies that America shows up, declares war on Tripoli, and then the Swedes show up and they're like, hey, we're here too, I guess, which is not how it worked. The Swedes were already at war with Tripoli when the war broke out with the United States. So the name of this card needs to be changed. It was actually the Americans who showed up to Tripoli, and then they saw a bunch of Swedes sitting there, and they were like, "Hey, what are you Swedes doing here?" And the Swedes are like, Well, we're here to chew bubblegum and sink Tripolitan Corsairs, and we're all out of bubblegum. Do you have any? And the Americans are like, no, we aren't. Looks like we gotta sink Corsairs. And then there was a bunch of synth music and air horns in the background, and aviator sunglasses came down over both of the captain's eyes as American music played in the background, and an eagle screeched, and then hold on. What is the national bird of Sweden? And a blackbird screeched in the background too, I guess. But yeah, that's basically what happened in history, and so it was. So how would I change this? Well, one thing that I actually really like about Shores of Tripoli is how so many of its cards are named after people doing things, and I wish this was named after the Swedish Commodore, whose name was Rudolf Sidestrom. I think I mispronounced that properly. I apologize if I pronounced it correctly. From what I understand, he was kind of a big deal in the Swedish Navy and was the guy in charge of the Swedish squadron. So just name the card after him. Or, if you want to keep with the verb tense of how some of the other cards go, you could say Rudolf Sedestrom coordinates patrols. And then that's great. And you also, I'm not crazy about the art. One common problem in this game, just sort of generally, is that you either have art that is a picture of a dude or a picture of a boat. Now, don't get me wrong. That can be fine. I mean, obviously with Jefferson, I mean it's a pretty iconic picture of Jefferson, so that's okay. And sometimes if it's like, hey, we built a boat early, there's a boat. Okay, but so many of them are just pictures of boats, especially for the boats or dudes, especially for the Tripolitanians. And so I wish this was a picture of the Swedish Commodore, or at least I don't know. That's just an idea. So again, this in terms of mechanics, good card. In terms of lore and picture, maybe change that. Hammett's army created. Yeah, this is good. Um, Although I don't know if I would use the word created here. Saying the army is created, I'm not sure about that. It's like it's not like the people who were part of the army didn't exist, and then Hammett waved his arm, and then up from the ground were fully formed flesh and blood Bedouins and Cretan and Greek mercenaries who were then ready to fight for America. Um, I would say formed. Hammett's army formed. Um, or again, this is me getting really pedantic. It really doesn't matter. In terms of design, it's good design. I think maybe you could argue the army's a little too strong at first, but I have other ideas for fixing that. So yeah, and that's all the three home cards, or I guess core cards as they're called. Okay, let's talk about the treaty. I actually really like the art on this. Um, One, because the banner is higher, so it pops out as being different, and this is your victory card, so it's like, oh hey, the victory card. I can notice it because it's set up differently, and there it is, the treaty. Now this is a noun card, which is interesting. So it's not Treaty of Peace and Amity signed, or capitulation, which I guess that's a noun, or Tripoli capitulates, or Tripoli signs a treaty. That would be verbing it. But I like the idea of making it a noun, because generally when you want noun cards is when it represents something very corporeal, like a person, or if it's a specific vessel. Which is why I think Launch the Intrepid maybe should just be called the Intrepid. Uh, but I'll get to that. Since there was a treaty called the Treaty of Peace and Amity, that's one of the more corporeal things on this list. Having the name not be verbed makes a lot of sense. As far as its design, it's really good. I mean, it's actually pretty easy. It's like, okay, what needed to happen in order for the treaty to be signed in history? These things needed to happen. That's what it is in history. And in case you're wondering about why all of the frigates need to be sunk, that is because when the Philadelphia ran aground and Yusef Karamanli was able to steal that boat, he used it as collateral for one of the loans that he had to Tunisia. And so that was just sort of keeping him in the fight of like, oh, I can fund this war longer because I can pay for these loans better now that I've taken this ship. This is great. But then the idea is you sink the frigates, and it's like, oh no, I can't pay for my loans, I gotta capitulate, hence the treaty. Okay, assault on Tripoli. Um, in terms of the name, it's fine. The art is good. It's the cover of the box, and it's the big, you know, moment, and it shows it's. I think the picture that shows the most ships doing a thing, and so yeah, that really works. So many pictures or pictures of boats doing things that maybe sometimes it gets lost. But if there's anything that deserves having a picture that's just boats doing things, it's this one. Um, so in terms of effect, it's fine. Um, it I would talk. I have things to say about Send in the Marines, but I'll get to that. Maybe I would change the name on. I don't know if I would say Victory or Death. I would specifically. Some people are a little confused by this. No, that means you fight until the end of the round. Anytime you have a card where it's sort of like, and then look in the rule book to see how this card works. That's generally bad design. It would be best if that information was most of that information was present on the card. And I understand these are the victory cards, and so it makes if there's going to be a card where it's like you have to look it up in the book because it's really important. I guess the victory cards are fine for that. But yeah, I wish that would say um, continue combat uh, until Tripoli is taken or the Americans are defeated. I don't know, maybe something more specific. It's not a big deal. Okay, so let's talk about naval movement. Naval movement is one of the worst designed cards that I think almost I've ever seen. Not in terms of mechanics. Its mechanics are great. It's fine. Move four American frigates, and resolve battles. That's fine. That's a good effect. I like that there's four of them, so you aren't guaranteed to get one, and you need to sort of manage when you want to use them. And generally, they come out when you need them, but maybe they don't. Very well designed. Calling a card naval movement is just lazy design. I'm sorry. It's just like I am playing the super specific historical event of boat move. What? Especially when all of these other things are referencing so many specific things or specific figures. It's just it like even in like the 1980s, a card like this would have been called something like Naval Campaign or coordinated patrols or something at least slightly less abstract. One metric that I use for judging how good a card is how abstract is it. The more abstract the card is, the worse the card is. It at that point you might as well be like, I'm going to play the card do a good thing. Or somewhat famously in Sentinels of the Multiverse, one character who's sort of a joke character has a card called the best card ever. And once you get that abstract, it's just dumb. And this is really abstract. So how would I change this? Well, you could just call it Naval Campaign, and then it feels more like an event. But what I think each of these naval movement cards should be named after one of the commodores of the American flotilla. There's a bunch of them that aren't in the game, like Richard Dale, Richard Morris, a lot of Richards. A lot of these, because in the campaign, actually, there was a whole lot of swapping out of leadership because a lot of people just weren't doing what Jefferson wanted. There were a lot of dragging of their feet. And, pick a captain or a commodore. There's a lot of different people, and you can just say, Richard Dale, or you can just call it Richard Dale, or Richard Dale coordinates American activity. And yeah, okay, you might be like, well, that's weird that it's different named cards that all have the same effect. Well, you know what? Get over it. I think it'd be cool to have each naval movement named after one of the commodores. Or, if not, at least just call it Naval Campaign, or something to denote this is a special action that is happening, because you can just discard a card to do a naval movement of 2, and this is just that but better. It doesn't evoke any sort of event or anything like that, or like call it favorable winds or something. Anyway, I've ragged on this enough. Hopefully you understand why I don't like this card in terms of lore design, but it's theoretically easily fixed. Okay, early deployment it has similar problems. It's still pretty abstract. there's a few ways that you could change this because it would be better to talk more, use a more specific example of why something is early deployed. Like, okay, so when you play a card, someone should be able to figure out, oh, this is why the thing is happening. Why are we able to move 4 spaces? Because Commodore Richard Dale is in charge and making us move 4, and he was a cool Commodore and was able to operate more efficiently. Okay, naval movement, why are we able to move 4? No idea. Early deployment, why are we able to deploy a ship 1 year earlier? No idea. So you could name it after certain shipyards that were efficient, or one thing you could do is you could rename this card like diverted tax funds, or Congress authorizes funding, if you wanted to be like Congress authorizes action and then Congress authorizes funding, because that was a thing where Congress over time was diverting funding away from the certain areas to fund the Navy, and this can represent that. That is way less abstract and more specific. So yeah, calling it Congress authorizes funding or diverts funding, or something along those lines. You know, look into history. What were things that happened in history where the Americans were then able to deploy boats because of it, and then name the card after that thing? Now, in terms of design of this card, I might change this to where instead of just being able to put it into patrol zones, it would be cool if you could also put it into a city. Because a lot of people look at this card and they're like, oh, we could save this card and use it to put a boat into Alexandria so we can get Hammett's army out quicker. But no, you can't do that with that. And that sort of makes the card only ever specifically played in specific circumstances, and there's not a lot of thought that is involved in that. Now, there's a little, so I wouldn't say the card needs a complete redesign. Like some of these cards I'm going to say are going to need a complete redesign. Um, but generally speaking, you want a card to have multiple uses where someone has to look at the card and be like, when do I want to play this? And not have the answer be immediately apparent. Um, because that is when strategy happens. Okay. Show of force. Again, this is like, it's pictures of boats, which is fine, I guess. I guess I would have preferred more like if you had shown this from the perspective of the Tunisians, or actually, no, I think it was Morocco that they intimidated, where they're reacting to all of the boats, or showing them firing off warning shots, or I don't know. It's fine. I mean, it's multiple. One thing that sort of annoys me is that the card requires you to move 3 boats, and there's a picture of 2 boats here. That kind of irks me because like someone can just glance at this and be confused. Like, find a picture of 3 boats. Come on. In terms of design, it's good. It's a well designed card. Especially this in contrast with Tribute Paid. Now this is interesting because this is sort of a noun card. It's not show force, which would be, the verb form of that card. It's a show of force. I think it's fine here because referring to something as a show of force is a military term and a diplomatic term that actually pretty specifically refers to something, so it's pretty corporeal, and given what's going on, most people can look at this card, look at the effect, and be like, oh, this is what's happening. You're intimidating the ally into backing down so you don't have to fight. Okay, I get it. And so let's talk about Tribute Paid, because it's similar. It's interesting. For some reason, the art style is different here. From what I would guess, the designer of this had access to very limited art. There's not a lot of art in this era or set of these conflicts, and so he was pulling from a small pile. But I love this. This is great art. Oh man, this is pretty good. It's weird because it's an American card, and it's like there's the guy, and he's like, "Hey, pay me tribute," and there's I forget what the name of the envoy was. It started with a C. The American envoy to Tripoli. Of course, this would be not Tripoli. This would be one of the allies. Um, Calling it tribute paid is a little weird. I feel like this should be verbed, like pay tribute. I'm gonna play pay tribute. Calling it tribute paid implies that you're playing a card representing the fact that you already paid tribute and they're acknowledging it, which is not what this card is representing. I think. I mean, it's true that America did pay tribute to a lot of the Barbary allies before this. And so is this representing the fact that because tribute was already paid, the ally is deciding not to go to war with you? I guess that's weird. It's cooler if it's the idea of you're going to pay tribute and you have to make that, and you just choose to do that, which I believe we did with Algeria. Which is why in 1815 America had to go back and then fight Algeria again. Um, so it's absolutely not a big deal. The name, and I like the art, so honestly not. Don't worry about it. In terms of design, uh, I'll talk about this when I get to Congress authorizes action. I actually really like the design of this card. This is a really well designed card. This is definitely a card where you pull it and you're like, ooh, do I want to play this? When do I want to play this? Do I ever want to play this? Or, oh, thank goodness I drew this card. And that's the sign of a really well designed card. Often you will never play this card. Sometimes you will. You'd rather get show of force, but sometimes you can't afford to send three frigates over to knock somebody down. And this is a really interesting dynamic between the two of these. Is either you send three frigates and you don't have to pay, or one frigate and you do have to pay. How well are you doing in keeping the pirates from stealing money from you? It's and then do you want to do it early because you don't want them to get value out of that ally? So, once they've raided twice with the ally, you might as well not even use the tribute. Then you're just tacking on 2 gold coins to what they already stole from you. But if you use it too early, you don't know how well the pirates have done in their rating so far, and you may have just given them the 2 gold that wins the game. This is honestly one of the best cards in the game in terms of design. Very good art, very good design. Not entirely crazy about the name, but oh man, just chef's kiss in terms of a well designed card. Okay, Constantinople demands tribute. In terms of art, it's good. In terms of the name, fine. It's a verb card, uh, which is okay. In terms of history, yes, Tripoli was technically a vassal of Constantinople. That was more in name than in practice, as far as I know. And they did send gifts to Constantinople, but it wasn't really a demanded thing. But maybe that's why it's an American card. Like, Tripoli isn't expecting Constantinople to demand a tribute. And so when this comes out, it's like, oh dear, our relations with Constantinople aren't as good. This has weakened the Barbary states to a degree, and thus we are less like we are more likely to capitulate, which is basically what the money supply is who is more likely to capitulate in a negotiation. Once you hit 12, America capitulates, and when it's not there, the Tripolitanians are willing to capitulate with the treaty. That's sort of what's going on here. Um, Now, with Constantinople demands tribute, one thing about this card, I will say it's a little strong, which you don't think given how simple it is. Um, and one idea I've had with this card, and this has to do with one of Tripoli's home cards, and this is an idea I actually really like, and I really think it should be playtested and checked out. And if you were to add this in, you might add some other things in to make sure balance is the same. But my idea is the card. Well, actually, you know what? I'll get to this when I talk about Constantinople Sensei. I'll just have you make to watch the rest of the video for me to talk about that. But all in all, generally a well designed card. Um, with art, I think this art is old. I think this is from the 1500s. But it's okay. Okay, Hammett recruits Bedouins is fine. It shows the Bedouins there being recruited. It's zoomed out a little bit, so you can't quite make the details. Um, uh, I might have said recruits mercenaries, not because he didn't recruit Bedouins, or that I don't want to talk about Bedouins, but there were a bunch of different types of mercenaries that were recruited. There were Cretan, and yes, Cretan is what you call someone from Crete. Sorry, it's that's not. It doesn't mean what you think it means. And Greek mercenaries, and also Bedouin mercenaries. Lots of different ones. So just focusing on the Bedouin ones is a little weird. I mean, it's not that weird. It's not a big deal. It just seems like the formation of the army represents the Bedouins, and then this card should represent, you know, Greek and Cretan mercenaries. Um, Now, one thing, we already have Hammett mentioned in Hammett's Army Created, which is fine. It's okay to mention the same guy more than once. I mean, it's General Eaton for both of these. I'll get to that in a little bit. But there were actually quite a few interesting characters in this army, one of which I really wish was mentioned in this game because he has this crazy life story, and that's Colonel Eugene Listendorf. He was Eaton's chief of staff during the March on Dern. Uh, he has the craziest life story. He had a whole bunch of different aliases. He fought for the Italians and the French. He fought, I think, for and against Napoleon at one point. He was going to be a monk. He got captured by Napoleon and put in jail because when he tried to switch sides, he was then they thought he was a spy, and then he poisoned his guards and escaped, and then went and escaped, and then was part of Napoleon's army again in the attack on Egypt, and then just sort of settled there by marrying some Coptic woman, and then formed a coffee shop, and then Eaton showed up, and then they became friends, and then he decided to help attack Dern, and then somehow made it to the United States and became an architect. He just has this absurd, crazy life story. I kind of wish the guy was referenced in the game, and since he was the chief staff of the general guy, it makes sense to be him like, oh yeah, he organizes troops, he gets more guys. Just, you know, a reference to the guy would be cool. But that's just me fanboying about history. Okay, Bainbridge supplies intel. So this is another, picture of a dude, and I like the verb. I love the verbing of these cards, especially for the characters, because if you just say Bainbridge, most people are going to be like, who is Bainbridge? Why does he let me pull a card from the discard pile? That doesn't feel very thematic. But when you explain that it's him supplying intel, they know a little bit more. Although I wish this went further. What this actually represents. So for those of you who don't know, Bainbridge was the captain of the Philadelphia, which is the ship that ran aground, and the Barbary pirates captured it. When he was captured and put in prison, he would send messages back to Preble and the people in charge, and he would write in invisible ink and give reports on the status of Tripoli and like how the status of morale and even like the location of gun emplacements, I think. And he would pass a lot of information to the Americans. In fact, from what I understand, a lot of what we know about what went on in Tripoli during the war is because of Bainbridge sending all of these secret letters. That's really cool. I wish this image showed like him writing in invisible ink, or someone looking at an image with invisible ink and seeing the invisible writing. Something to more sort of show, or showing him in jail writing the thing. Some people would say it's weird that you can get this card before the Philadelphia runs aground. But in that sense, maybe you should rename it to Prisoners Supply Intel, because there were other American prisoners, and I suppose it's theoretical that any of them could have supplied intel. But I want to mention Bainbridge here, because at the time, a lot of people really harped on Bainbridge for losing the Philadelphia and really blamed him. And like, you should have fought harder, you shouldn't have just given it up. Why didn't you know about that reef? And it's like, come on, man, it was an uncharted reef. And all of his intel that he supplied to the United States helped them so much, it really redeemed him. And so it seemed he should be included in the game in here to represent that. And then that got me the idea, oh, well, hold on. The Tripolitanians rolling well on the Philadelphia runs aground where they get the ship. That's such a good card. What if you changed this card to where it starts out of the deck, and then hold on, I'm going to just go to, and then for the Philadelphia runs aground, you do, for the 5 and 6 result, it's frigate captured, take an American frigate as sunk, place one Tripolitan frigate in the harbor of Tripoli, then place the card Bainbridge supplies aid, or supplies intel, in the American player's hand. And that's how they get that card. It would be more thematic, because it's like, okay, they've captured Bainbridge, and then Bainbridge starts secretly supplying intel. It would make the game less swingy, because this really powerful card, the Americans only get if the Tripolitanians have stolen a frigate. And stealing a frigate is a huge deal in this game, because they can't get the treaty with a frigate. And so if there's another frigate, it's like, oh my gosh. It's going to be really hard to win by treaty. And so, if the Tripolitanians fail the Philadelphia role and only sink the frigate or only get the worst result, then they have this consolation prize of, oh, well, at least the Americans never get Bainbridge. I think it would be more balanced. I think it would be more thematic and historic. It would make the game a little more complicated, but I kind of like it. I kind of like it as a variant. That I have other ideas that I'll talk about. That's one of the ones that I really like. Okay, Congress authorizes action. So this card is. I like that it's not a picture of boats. It's like, hey, look, that's Congress. There they are, theoretically authorizing action. Yeah, that's fine. The effect. So here's the problem with this card. This card is always a, oh, I drew it. I'll play it immediately when I get a chance. That when there isn't, like, when I don't immediately need to move guys to, say, block off Tripoli or do something else that's important. Ah, it kind of, so that makes it like an autoplay card. And that's not great design. Like, Bainbridge Supplies Intel is a great card because, like, when do you play it? I don't know. When do you play it? You can play it a bunch of times. Show of Force, do you wait? Do you play it immediately? Do you really need your guys patrolling Tripoli? Tribute paid. Oh, yeah, when do you play that? Even naval movement. Do I really need to move all 4 of my guys now? Do I want to save this? Congress authorizes action, you just kind of always play it. And I don't think that's good design. Now, I do like the idea of you don't know when you're going to get your other 2 frigates as the Americans. You don't know when you're going to be able to play this card, which is going to increase the ability for you to get more frigates on the board. That's good design in terms of the general game space of the game. But what I'm saying is there should be some sort of cost or negative to this card that makes it not just an auto play. And the idea I had was I was thinking back to a famous line from the era in this war, which either apocryphally or it was associated, I think, with James Monroe of the Monroe Doctrine, where he had mentioned, and I could be completely wrong on this, correct me if I'm wrong, where he said, millions for defense, but not 1 cent for tribute, which I feel like is what this card should be named, and sort of representing this change in mindset from, we are not going to pay you tribute at all of our money is going to be going into building ships to pwn you pirates. And I think if this card represented that, it would be interesting if once you play this card, you no longer can play tribute paid for the event. So then it becomes an interesting question of like, oh, if I play this now, I can't use tribute paid. Now, maybe I don't want to use tribute paid anyway, because already it's a card that pays money and there's a lot of cost associated with it. But maybe I want to wait. Or maybe I don't want to wait. It adds questions and interesting things. It makes it where drawing Congress authorizes action on the first turn is no longer necessarily an autoplay. And it kind of makes it where you're pretty much going to need to use Bainbridge to get the 2 shows of force. But if you're playing with the other variant, where you don't get Bainbridge until Philadelphia runs aground, maybe you wait to see if Philadelphia runs aground first before you have a Congress authorized action. And that's when things can get really interesting. I think it's simple enough because, once it's played, it's out of the game, and you just have it out of the game, and you're like, okay, remember, can't play tribute paid now because Congress has decided that we're doing war, we're not doing tribute. I think that would be an interesting change. Again, these are all kind of nerfs. I'll buff and nerf a little bit of some Tripoli stuff to try to make it balanced. You can. I think the designer of this is watching this. Do what you will with any of these ideas. These are all just ideas. Okay, Corsairs Confiscated. I like the idea behind this card. I'm not crazy about the art. If it's a picture of Corsairs being confiscated, where are the Corsairs? Were they confiscated? This is a picture of a mountain. What does a mountain have to do with Corsairs being confiscated? Is this a picture of Gibraltar, I guess? Because that's what this is representing? Not crazy about it. And also, it's weird that it's past tense like this. It's not like Burn the Philadelphia was, the Philadelphia is burned. Okay, that makes it sound like it's a thing that happened, not a thing that you do. It's like, it should be confiscate Corsairs. I think what this is representing the fact that this would be the British who were doing this, and you don't have control over the British, and so in that sense, it's actually Horatio Nelson who's doing this, which, if you don't know, in the middle of the war with the Barbary pirates, at one point, the Barbary pirates accidentally sunk a British ship, and then Horatio Nelson showed up, and he was like, what? the heck are you guys doing attacking British ships? And I think he even like bombarded Tripoli Harbor and very sternly reminded them that they are not at war with the British, and it was a pretty epic moment. Um, and so, in that sense, you could have this card represent him. You could show him on it. You could call it Nelson Intervenes, and then, hey, it's a picture of a person, and you're reminding people more about history, and it's cool. Um, in terms of design, it's good. I do like all the interplay of how many people do you want to try to block Gibraltar to keep the Corsairs in Tripoli from escaping? How long do you want to keep them there? Do you want to try to break out anyway, even when you're being blocked? Or do you want to wait and tie up those frigates, but then risk Corsairs confiscated being drawn? That's all good design. Part of me kind of wishes there was another effect for this, for if, like, Murad Reyes just breaks out and escapes. Um, Even if it was something as simple as just sinking a frigate in Tripoli. And if you were to do that, you would rename it, Nelson Intervenes, and it would represent that effect of Nelson coming in and bombarding Tripoli. Look up the history yourself before you add something like this to make it good. But all in all, a well-designed card honestly doesn't really need to change. Maybe change the tense of the name and get a picture of some Corsairs being confiscated. Okay, Burn the Philadelphia. This is good. I mean, there it is. There's the Philadelphia burning. Part of me feels like the card should show like people fighting on the decks, or more of like during the combat instead of after the fact, since this can fail. You want the art to evoke like, oh, will this work or will it not? Um, but I mean, the burning of the Philadelphia was a major event in the history of the war. They refer to the event as burning of the Philadelphia, and there's the Philadelphia burning. You can't get much better than that. In terms of design, I actually really like it. Now, normally I don't like these 1 and 2 results where nothing happens, and I'm like, oh, it's too much of a swing. Um, the fail effect is too much of a nothing card. It really feels like you wasted stuff. But I'm okay with it in this case because towards the end of the game, the 3 and 4 effect becomes just as good as the 5 and 6 effect. So it's like 2/3 of the time this is majorly good for you. And so I think that's fine. Unlike with Launch the Intrepid. One Corsair sunk is so much of like just a cheap consolation prize where you're just delaying, which as the Americans is fine, it's okay to delay, that I feel like the 1 and 2 effect shouldn't be nothing. What I would actually change it to is Corsair's damaged. And you take a Corsair and you put it on the next year of the track. A Corsair, and then you get that Corsair back, which is like, it's next to nothing. It's almost like sinking one, but it makes the card a little more strategic and a little more like, oh, maybe it's worth it to play this without Stephen Decatur. I wouldn't change it for Burn the Philadelphia because these two results are always good. With Launch the Intrepid, you're basically only going for the final result, and so because of that, people generally exclusively use Stephen Decatur for the Intrepid, which I think isn't as good. And I think the reason for that is because the 1 to 4 is so bad. And so I think if you make the 1 to 2 a little better, it's sort of like, oh, with Burn the Philadelphia, these two results are good, this one does nothing. This result is at least kind of good, this result is kind of good, and this result is very good. And so it spreads it out more. And it gives both cards a sense of difference. One thing you don't want to do when you're designing a card is make two cards that are too similar. And don't get me wrong, the designers have done a good job making these different. This one attacks boats, this one attacks frigates, both can hit frigates. This one can hit frigates better and can't hit boats, this one can hit boats a little better. But I think you could make that even more if you changed 1 and 2, like how I said. Now, in terms of the art, I mean, it's fine. There's the Intrepid blowing up. I'm not crazy about the word launch here, and here's why. Calling it Launch the Intrepid implies that this is the first time the Intrepid is being launched. That's not true. The Intrepid was used all throughout the war, and what this is actually representing is the final launch of the Intrepid, which maybe is what you should call it, the final launch of the Intrepid, or just call it the Intrepid. Or fire ships, or the Intrepid converted to fire ships, or the Intrepid explodes. Or something. Well, not that. That would, because that implies the Intrepid's an enemy ship. So the Intrepid was a Corsair that the Americans got and sort of converted into their own covert ops ship, because since it looked like one of the Corsairs' boats, they used it, first of all, to sneak in and burn the Philadelphia, and I believe they used it for scouting and stuff, and for a whole bunch of different things. It was their small little, like, Millennium Falcon ship that they used. It was Stephen Decatur's ship, and they did a bunch of cool stuff with it. And it was the thing that they used to burn the Philadelphia. And the final thing they tried to do is to use it as a fire ship into the harbor, and it failed, which is actually one thing I like about these two cards. So the historic event of like what America rolled in real life here was a 5 and 6. What America rolled on this card was a 1 and 2. The launching of the Intrepid was a failure and didn't destroy any ships. It might have destroyed some like rowboats that were sent to intercept it, because when they sent the Intrepid in, the Corsairs were able to determine, wait a minute, that's not one of our Corsairs. Look at that. It has American flags drawn all over it. And Stephen Decatur is like, dang it, I told you guys not to do that. And then they attacked it and boarded it. And we aren't sure if like they blew it up to try to kill the guys who were boarding it. And so you could argue, okay, they killed some guys and damaged some boats. So maybe the historic event is that it took a Corsair and put it on the next phase. I would do that, especially since I'm introducing a bunch of stuff that nerfs the Americans. I feel like I should buff some of these other cards. Okay. General Eaton attacks Dern. I actually also really love the design of this card. The image is good. It's a little busy, but that's kind of how art was at the time. This is much better. Oh my gosh, this is really good art. I absolutely love that in order to attack Dern, you have to have the specific card that lets you do it. Because the attack on Dern was like the surprise thing that Tripoli didn't see coming. Because they had to cross all of this desert and deal with all of these logistical problems and mercenaries that were deserting and OPSEC and all of this stuff. And so it isn't just this thing that you can do. Like in most war games, it's just like, okay, I'm going to make an action to move my guys from this place to this other place, which, you know, you can do with boats to move 2 boats. But like for attacking Dern, you have to have the specific card to attack Dern. Part of me wishes that referenced like, you know, shortcut discovered, or, you know, something that more represents like, oh, the shortcut to Dern. This card represents the knowledge and logistical setup to do the attack on Dern. But it's fine. One thing I will change, or will suggest changing for this card and another, and this is entirely petty, put a single quotation mark around the word general. Because General Eaton was no such thing. He was not a general. He was like, he was a much, he wasn't, I mean, he was a Marine. He was a much lower rank. He called himself general basically to command more of the Bedouins' respect. And is like, no, yeah, this is this army here that I'm commanding, so I'm a general. And it wasn't petty. It wasn't just him being petty. Some people I think that it was him being petty. No, this was him because he didn't want the people to disrespect him of thinking that he's not the leader of the contingent, which he was supposed to be. And there was a lot of infighting and stuff. And so I think just not double quotes, a single quote around the word general. I think even after the fact, and I could be totally wrong on this, I think they made him a general after the fact just to sort of be like, in honor of his, you know, his great victory here. So I would add a single quote around the word general. And that's a fun little history thing where when someone looks at the card, they're like, wait, why is general in quotes here? And then they can look it up and be like, oh, and then they learn something. You know, that's fun. Also, General Eaton attacks Benghazi. I love this card. And here's why. General Eaton never attacked Benghazi. But he planned to, and that was in the cards, so to speak. It was a plan of, if, you know, they didn't capitulate. In fact, he really wanted to attack Benghazi and then to attack Tripoli. In fact, the whole assault on Tripoli is a thing that never happened. I mean, there were attacks on Tripoli in the sense that they bombarded and there were a lot of fights in Tripoli harbor, but in terms of a land assault on Tripoli to take Tripoli, never happened in the war. But it was always something that they planned to do. And so, because of that, I love that it's a thing that you can do in the game. One of the most important things for a board game, a historic board game to do, is to show what could have happened, and not just have history on shuffle. General Eaton very well could have attacked Benghazi. They could have assaulted Tripoli. The Burn the Philadelphia raid could have not failed. In fact, I think Horatio Nelson called the attack on the Philadelphia like the most daring raid in history. You know, he talked it up as like, oh my gosh, that was so amazing. And even the Pope was like, whoa, hey, America, even in its infancy, is fighting the Turks, because they called all of them Turks. Because again, the Tripolitanians were associated with the Ottomans, who were Turks. It's like they're fighting the Turks better than all of you Christian nations, which I think was kind of a stab at a lot of the other ones which are capitulating. Um, so, what was I talking about? Oh yeah, history. I like that it shows a theoretical thing that can happen. One thing I will say about both of the attack cards, they seem a little strong, um, and just a little though. I think three American frigates might be too much. That seems too much of just like a free thing to do. Like that's a lot of dice. I think it should be one American frigate, and then that sort of makes gunboats a lot better. Not that I think gunboats are bad, but because well, I'm gonna have some other ideas that might nerf gunboats. But it just seems like it's more of a reward for building a gunboat, which I feel like is good. I think one frigate would be better because the Battle of Dern in game, it America seems to just always win it. And the Battle of Dern was not like a huge it wasn't a foregone conclusion. That the sides were a lot closer in terms of power and strength. And yes, it was thanks to O'Bannon and some surprise of the whole fact and just some general tenacity on the part of the Americans. And there's a reason why that we sing about the shores of Tripoli. Well, not we. The Marines sing about the shores of Tripoli. I don't want to imply I'm a Marine. That would be stolen valor, which is illegal and also just not nice. I'm not saying that, but I think the battle in it seems like protecting Dern is such a lost cause for Tripoli in this game that they don't have much incentive to do it. So I feel like if we just toned this down to one and tone this down to one frigate, I think that might be a little better. Lieutenant Starrett in Pursuit. Oh man, I love the art on this. This is really good. I love the action shots and that it's not just a picture of a guy. You know, like Preble's boys take aim. Show Preble's boys taking aim behind the cannons. It should be something more like this. Not okay, but you know, the other part of me is like, hey, you know, we have a portrait of the guy who did the cool things. Show him, teach people things. Okay, fine. This is good. This is a good card. Whether or not to discard it to do a thing or to play it because it's a really good battle card. Very interesting. Very good. Preble's boys take aim. Same deal. Part of me thinks like this should be able to be played the uh, in the Tripoli attacks card. Not because I think it will ever see play, but just it will give it more options, and therefore, because there are more options to use the card, it is something that is more like, hey, should I use this or not? But but what I mean by that is it'll have more questions as to whether or not a card should be played or not. Um, but yeah, it's fine. It's fine. Daring Stephen Decatur, I love it. I love that it's named and how and you know that it's representing this like swashbuckling guy who was had all these crazy plans. He was the guy who was behind the burning of the Philadelphia and the launching of the Intrepid, which is why he can be used on both. And I love that he can be used on either card because then it becomes a question. Do I use it to try to burn the Philadelphia or launch the Intrepid? That's an interesting choice. How great that he can be used on two cards and can't just be used on one, making it basically a non-choice. Ominous music begins. We'll get to that when we get to it. Okay, send in the Marines. Art is good. They're the Marines. They're being sent in. I love it. I do wish that this card could be played on any land battle or any battle that involves troops going somewhere. I think they phrased it this way because they didn't want people to think that you could just bombard Dern on turn 2 and play send in the Marines. Okay, then don't specify that, or maybe just limit it to fall, or limit it in the same way that Hammett's army is done. If it's spring of 1804 or later, you can play send in the Marines. I think you should be able to play send in the Marines anywhere. Although being able to play it, that's something I haven't thought out. Being able to play it without Hammett's army, that's a bit of a change. The main point is, I think when Hammett's army attacks Dern, you should be able to play send in the Marines. Should you? Probably not. But getting the option at least makes it more interesting. When a card only has one use, it is less interesting. And there's already an incentive to take send in the Marines. Lieutenant Bannon leads the charge, and Marine sharpshooters. Hold on to all of those 3 cards and save them for the final attack on Dern. There's already so much of an incentive to do that in the game. The fact that this card can only be used for that just incentivizes that more. And I don't want that strategy to not exist. It's a good strategy. I love that strategy. It's one of the three ways that America has the path to victory. I just wish that, like with a Lieutenant O'Bannon leads the charge. It can be used in any combat. Same with Marine sharpshooters. Which one should you use it on? Well, probably Tripoli, but you could use it on the Battle of Dern if you wanted to. I think sending the Marines should be the same way. Okay, so that's all the American cards. I will move on to the Tripolitanian cards, which I have a lot more to say about. Um, and so we'll start with the one that I don't have a lot to say about. Yusef Koromanli. Yeah, it's a good card. Good design. Really like the counterplay to it and how you have to play around it. It's really interesting. When do you play it? Do you play it with only one ally? What if there's a whole bunch of people blockading Tripoli and you're going to get a bunch of intercept rolls? Should you wait? That's really interesting. Managing. Do you try to get multiple allies and do this super attack? Really well designed. Really good. Same with Jefferson. It's his name. It's his picture. There he is. That's consistent. Okay. Murad Reyes breaks out. Not a lot to say about this either. It's good. Part of me thinks that it seems almost too weak for the Americans to even try to intercept. And one thing I saw a lot in the tournament, and I watched a whole lot of tournament games, is that people would generally just not even try to intercept this. And so that makes me think that maybe this card should say any American frigates in the patrol zone of Gibraltar may first make an interception roll, and on this interception roll hit on a 5 and 6. And that's the only time that they hit on a 5 and 6. Because it's not like these Corsairs are escaping from their own home port and going who knows where to capture any American ships. No, these ones are breaking out of not their own port, a hostile port. Well, not a hostile port, but a port that belongs to another power that is full of enemy ships, and they're going specifically to Tripoli. So the chance of intercepting is way higher, it would seem. And I think that incentivizes Americans to do more of the game of chicken, where you're blockading Gibraltar, and then it's like, oh, are you going to wait until I get Corsairs confiscated? And then the Tripolitanian player is like, are you going to keep those frigates tied up while I'm raiding from Tripoli? And I think that dynamic happens more if you make it a little stronger with the interception roll. And another reason why I'm buffing this why I'm nerfing this, or why I think it should be nerfed, is because I have a lot of buffing that's going to happen with a lot of stuff down here. So, Constantinople sends aid. So here's the deal with this card. Art is fine. It shows a whole lot of stuff going on. It's like, oh my gosh, Constantinople. That works. Here's the problem with this card. There's a few problems. In terms of game design, it's very good because it ensures a level of very interesting balance and encouraging people to reward people for saving certain cards and using certain cards strategically. And a lot of the game turns on this card of how long are the Tripolitanians going to be able to prevent the treaty win because they get a frigate from this card. That's a big part of the game, so changing that in any significant way would change the game. But here's the problem. Constantinople did not send aid to Tripoli. At least not any significant amount that I'm able to find. And I think even the designer said that this is supposed to be sort of a theoretical card. That's fine. I love adding theoretical cards into a game of like, well, this didn't happen in history, but it could have. In Constantinople, yeah, they just got done fighting a war with France, and they were about to have a big war with Russia, so they were sort of not having the funds or equipment to be able to really support this war. But what if they did anyway? Or what if the war with France went better? The problem with that is Constantinople is always played when Dern is taken. When Dern is taken, immediately Constantinople sends aid is played, because it gives you 2 infantry, 2 corsairs, and a frigate. There is almost never a time when Constantinople is not immediately played when Dern is taken. And if not, then it's the next action that's taken. So this is no longer a theoretical. This isn't always. So there's 2 ways that you could change this. One, and this is the simplest, it's just a change in theme. You don't call it Constantinople sends aid, you call it Desperate Defense. Or you call it something like you call it something like Hassan Bey strengthens Tripoli. He was like Hassan Bey was basically one of the like land military commanders of Tripoli, which I feel like he should be in this game. But I'll get to that. So you just name it to desperate defense because when Dern was taken, there was this big oh no moment in Tripoli. It's like, oh quick, we got to recruit all these guys. We got to strengthen our defenses. The war is really serious now. We just lost our capital of our biggest province. Oh no, and that really is what this card is representing, is the oh no moment where they entrench really hard. And so the historic event is really more of Philadelphia gets captured, the Philadelphia then gets burned, Dern is taken, this card is played, giving a frigate to Tripoli, and then America attacks Tripoli and does enough damage to kill that frigate, and then maybe the pirate raid, and then America plays the treaty and wins. That's like the historic event sequence of events that happened. Because while Dern was under attack, there was a big battle going on in Tripoli to attack a bunch of their boats, and you could say that in game that represents Tripoli playing this card and then America attacking and destroying the frigate, allowing them to do it. So I'm not saying that like history isn't a thing that can happen given a sequence of events in this card, but calling it Constantinople Sends Aid is just wrong. I think the designers thought, oh, well, this card is going to represent a thing that could happen, but no, this is the thing that always happens. So if you just name it Desperate Defense, you name it, name it after the Hassan Bey guy, where he solidifies strength, he even like almost counterattack, started to counterattack Dern when it was taken immediately. Um, you name it something like that. There was this big oh no moment when it was taken. The other idea, and this I really like as an idea. This goes back to the other card that I was talking about. Constantinople Sends Tribute, and here's how I would do this: keep the name, keep the art, keep the effect. Change setup. This card starts face down in that it cannot be used. Once the Americans play Constantinople Demands Tribute, then the card flips and can be used. And then once it's used, it's out of the game. So, if the Americans never play Constantinople Demands Tribute, which I should tell you is a huge ask, that card is super powerful, and America basically has to play that card in any given game. But if America can pull off never playing that card, which means the Tripolitanians have a huge chance to win by piracy, because it means that America's not playing it once, and it means they're not playing it twice with Bainbridge, then they don't get Constantinople Sends Aid. But that should mean that they have a really good chance of winning by piracy. And it becomes this really interesting question of, oh, do I play Constantinople Demands Tribute? Because if I play it, yeah, I'm less likely to lose to piracy, and the pirates are really getting at me right now. But it means they get Constantinople Sends Aid, and maybe I can try to take Dern without that problem. It would need to be balance tested, but I think it would be really cool. I think it would be a really interesting change to the game. And maybe you would want to incorporate some of the other changes I suggested if you did that, but it would make it more thematic. It would add more strategy to the game, I think. And yeah, it's kind of a nerf to Tripoli, but just wait. I have some buffs to Tripoli on here that I think you will be very interested in. Starting with, U.S. supplies run low. So I had a conversation with a dev on this on Board Game Geek, and a lot of people, and they endeavored to convince me that this card could be used. I'm not convinced. I think literally this card never provides value. And here's why. Moving one American frigate back to Malta is it undoes half of one action that the Americans can do by discarding any card, which is moving two guys. And the explanation that the designer gave me is that, oh, well, if there's two frigates in the harbor of Tripoli, you could play this card, and then there would be one frigate, and then the next turn you could play Tripoli attacks and attack a single American frigate. Yeah, except here's the problem with that. You play U.S. supplies run low, the next action immediately, the American player just moves the frigate back, and then does another thing. You have successfully not stalled because you basically gave your opponent a free move action in exchange for you not building a Corsair. So this is basically costing you a Corsair in order to undo half of one of America's actions. It's just bad. It it is literally helping America for you to play this card for the event. That is bad design. It's a trap card. It Yeah, you're literally helping America if you play this card. Um, so how would I change it? I mean, either I would buff the heck out of this and make it, and this is what I really think it should be, half, either rounded up or rounded down, you can playtest it, of the American frigates in the harbor of in a naval patrol zone moved to the harbor of Malta. Yeah, half. So then it becomes sort of like storms, where it's the thing that you do to try to counter a big blockade. And yeah, it can still then probably be countered by a single action. Um, or if you wanted to keep it more in the theme of what uh, the designers wanted, I would add this. And this actually might make it worth it. You move one American frigate to any naval patrol zone in the harbor of Malta, then perform one additional action. That might make it good. Because you could play it and then play Tripoli attacks. Or play it and then pirate raid. That at least provides a modicum of value. So either one of those could fix it. The image is a little weird. It's more like picture of boats. I think this is supposed to be Malta. It's coming back to Malta. I don't know. I feel like if it's going to be U.S. supplies run low, show the supplies running low or something. And part of the reason that I'm harping on this card so long is that supply problems were a big problem for the Americans in this war. Them running out of supplies and having to send boats back was a big thing for them to have to worry about. When I play Shores of Tripoli, I feel like I never have to worry about that because people never play this card. And if a Tripoli player were to play this card, I would be like, yay! Wonderful! Free action for me! And it's just bad. I would change it. Name of the card is good though. U.S. supplies run low. So I agree with that. Okay, let's talk about all the raid cards. So, for the most part, love the raid cards, love the raid mechanic, love the ally mechanic in this game. Very good. In terms of art, it's weird that this one is just showing guys. I guess that's the deck of a ship, so that's fine. Um, I I think it would have been a little better if it was consistent where all of these were boats, so that it was easier to be like, oh, okay, the raid cards are the ones that show the ocean battle. All right, yeah, and that makes it easier, I guess. Uh, One thing I will say, and this is not really necessary or even something that I think maybe should be changed, but I think it might slightly improve these cards and might improve the game in general. One thing that can tend to happen with an ally is you summon an ally, the Americans either blockade it or they do an attack and they sink one or two ships. And so you have one or two Corsairs in the harbor. And at that point, these cards become worthless. Now, I don't really like that because these cards become worthless anyway so often. And that's fine. The whole like I summon an ally, the ally's gone with tribute or show of force. Now these cards are worthless. That feels fine. That feels okay. But losing a Corsair and then it feels like it's not worth it to play an Algerine Corsair raid. I feel like maybe, and so this is my suggestion. I would say you keep the normal text, and so for example with the Algerine, pirate raid with all Corsairs from the harbor of Algiers, or if you have one or two Corsairs in the harbor of Algiers, produce one Corsair. I think you should have the option, and this is especially true if you have just one Corsair there, where you're like, oh, I want to build Corsairs here so that he has to actually pay tribute or actually use show of force instead of just being able to destroy it for free with gunboats and raids. And then, yeah, you're giving up pirate raiding for basically trying to ensure more likely that a treaty win happens. Should it be played for that effect? I would say most of the time no, but adding the option to, I think, makes it interesting. Again, it's only if you have one or two, so you can't get more than three, and you can't summon an ally if you have zero. Um, but I think it would be cool because it makes sense anyway. I mean, these are their own factions. You're telling me they can't build more ships? They can raid. They can do the if Tripoli can do the action of raiding or building. Why can't the Allies do the action of raiding or building? You just limit it to they can't go more than three, and you can't just bring them into war if they haven't been. It's one or two. And I think most of the time people will still just raid with these cards. But by giving the options, I think it'll make the game more interesting. Okay, let's talk about troops to Dern and troops to Benghazi. Both of the arts are good. It's like, hey, they're the guys, they're going. I like the Benghazi one more. It seems like a bigger deal, so I feel like the art of these should be swapped, but it's not a big deal. I do wish these were actually named after, like, name it after Hassan Bey deploys troops to Dern. We don't know a whole lot about a lot of the officials or dudes that fought for Tripoli, and we know a ton about the Americans. There's a ton of cards named after American people. I think a ton of Tripoli cards should be named after Tripoli guys. We basically only have Yusef Koromanli, and Murad Reyes, I think, is the name of the ship. There are other captains and other officials that were doing things in this era. So, give them the names. It seems. And I do this as someone who thinks that, like, the Barbary pirates were pure evil and America was totally justified, and the Barbary pirates were among the worst forces in history because they helped found and further the slave trade, and they were just the worst, and they had all of this horrible torture and helped start galley slavery, which would literally use people as fuel for ships and work them literally to death and all of this bad stuff. But I think if there was a person who did notable things for Tripoli, they should be in the game just as well as the Americans should. Um, just to teach history, so naming Hassan Bey, especially for the Dern one, because I think he was the one who sort of headed the Dern defense. Or if not, look up the guy who did and name the card that. So, for these cards, the troops cards, they're generally very weak, which is fine. Not every card needs to be strong, and I want you to understand that. Not every card needs to be the Philadelphia runs aground. But it currently doesn't feel like in the game there's a whole lot of counterplay to the Americans just wanting to take Dern. And I don't think there should be a ton. I think it should be mostly a foregone conclusion, but as is, it seems like America wins 90% of the time. And I feel like America should win more like 70% of the time. One idea I had, and this is especially true for troops to Benghazi, this card is so bad. It's so worthless to reinforce Benghazi because treaty wins are just so much better, or a direct assault on Tripoli. There's just no reason really to have to go through Benghazi and attack the long way. That's such a rare thing to happen. And part of me feels like because of that, I almost would combine these cards to, like, deploy troops, or just call it Hassan Bey deploys troops, and then both of them have the effect of either put 2 troops in Dern or 3 troops in Benghazi. And then it becomes this interesting choice where it's like, oh, do I want to reinforce Dern? Or do I want to reinforce Benghazi? And I can get a lot of guys in Benghazi. Maybe if I think I can prevent a treaty win, I can super reinforce Benghazi. And you can argue, like, oh, since Benghazi is in between Dern and Tripoli, you're able to deploy troops to it better. That's an idea. The other idea I had was just a kind of a complete change of how some of the combat works, and that's getting out of cards, which is what I was talking about, which is for Dern and Benghazi, they get 1 cannon shot against boats for every 2 troops they have in there, which is just like a little something something. Because Dern did have coastal batteries. Like, it didn't have a lot. It didn't have nearly as many as Tripoli did. And yeah, Guns of Tripoli is a thing for Tripoli for a reason. But Dern did have guns, so even if it's just like, oh, you get 2 shots, maybe you damage a frigate, that's cool. My point is, I don't think America bombarding Dern should just be a free thing. Like, there should be an amount of risk associated with it. If they're getting in close enough to try to shell Dern, they should be in close. It should be a risk, and for them to be shot by Dern. So that's the other change that maybe I would do. It's a small change. It's not a big one. Since you gave inherent defense to Tripoli in the form of the Fortress Tripoli variant, it feels like there should be something, just a little something for Dern and Benghazi. Troops to Tripoli, love the card. Really well designed. Definitely, but my idea of combining these two, don't combine this. Tripoli should be its own thing. Choosing if or slash when you want to play this, a very big deal and is very interesting. Okay. Storms, great card, wouldn't change it, except for something I will get into later when I talk about a different card. I do really like how this card is designed, and honestly wouldn't change it. Maybe I would prefer if the card maybe showed an actual shipwreck or showed more of a storm and less of a boat, because so many of these cards are like, hey, look at this boat. But yeah, nothing else to say about that. Tripoli attacks. I do like the card. I like that this card is in the game. I like that it's a threat, um, and really wouldn't change it. Its design is good. I kind of maybe wish Preble's Boys Took Aim could be played during the Tripoli attack. Um, rarely will you play this card, but it's still pretty good in certain circumstances. It lets you do something with your frigates, which is good. Yeah, wouldn't change it. Sweden pays tribute. Wouldn't change it. It's a good card. I like it. Yeah, it says the name. I explained already how I really like the dynamic of choosing whether or not you want to bring the Swedes in. I like the art, really. It's like, oh, the sunset is going down. So it's the sunset on this campaign. The Swedes are no longer taking part. They're leaving. You see the boat presumably going out there to either they're getting on the boats to leave or they're sending out the tribute. Oh, it's a good card. I like it. And yeah, the 2 gold is significant. I wouldn't change it. Okay. Tripoli acquires Corsairs. Okay. This is a bad card. In game, it's a great card. No, in game, it's you want to play it right away. And the art is fine, I guess. I mean, it's a picture of a boat being launched, which is fine. The name is super dumb. It's like with naval movement. It's so abstract. It's like Tripoli build boat. Tripoli get boat. Tripoli already can get boat by discarding a card. Why is Tripoli able to get 2 boat? Why? Because card says so. I look at this card and I am not able to tell the story. Why was I able to get 2 Corsairs this turn? Why? What happened? What event historically happened that is allowing me to get more Corsairs? Am I trading better? Did I get a shipment from somewhere? Was there some skilled shipbuilder who was working for Tripoli that turn that built more Corsairs? Did what happened? Like with Merchant Ship Converted, I know what happened there. One ship went over to another ship and preached Islam to that ship, and then that ship converted to Islam and then became an Islam ship. I mean, I understand what's going on with that card. I don't know what's going on here with Tripoli acquires Corsairs, which is a shame because there were events that happened in history that did allow Tripoli to prosper more in terms of its ability to wage war at certain parts. Early on in the war, there was this really great harvest that they had, a really plentiful harvest where they were able to get a lot more resources than they usually were. And Yusef Cormanli was like, ha, I can totally fight these Americans. I even had a really great harvest this year, and I can really do things great. So I would call this card Plentiful Harvest, or something like that. Or increased trade, or something that represents a real actual event that took place that allowed them to get more Corsairs. Unfortunately, that's not the end of the problem. The other problem with this card is that it's an autoplay. And autoplays are not good design. You get this card and you're like, oh, this is just a better version of what I do. I will play this now. Now, you may be saying, well, what about naval movement? Naval movement is just a better version of an action you already have. Yeah, but with naval movement, often you do have a lot of things you want to do, other things you want to do. And sometimes you don't want to play naval movement necessarily right away, because often your boats are already where they need to be. When to play naval movement is an interesting choice, and the fact that there's 4 of them makes sense. And the biggest reason is that naval movement provides an individual benefit on a single turn, or a single year if you want to be talking strategic. Tripoli acquires Corsairs basically gives you a benefit for the rest of the game, because the Corsairs will stick around until they die. So, because of that, you just always play the card, and that's not strategic. So how would I change this card? Well, there's a few things you can do, but the general thing that I would do is I would give the card a variable return of some kind, where it's not necessarily two Corsairs, it's some different amount. And one idea I had while I was thinking about what to do with Dern and Benghazi is maybe you rename the card to Plentiful Harvest, and it's gain a Corsair for every two infantry in Benghazi and Dern. And that actually becomes really interesting because then it becomes this thing where it's like, oh, I actually want to build up in Benghazi or do want to build up in Dern. And if you were to change it this way, I wouldn't change how Dern and Benghazi worked. And it's like, oh, I want to build those places up so they can build boats better. And then if America sees the Tripolitan player building up in Benghazi or Dern, they're like, oh man, I really actually do need to raid here. I'm not just going to auto win by plopping down Hammett's army and then bombarding a whole bunch and then moving in and taking it. I actually want to attack early to keep him from having two, because again, if they have three, then you only get the one because it's for every two. So even if you kill one guy, you've basically killed a Corsair. But then it can become this bluff thing where you play troops to Dern as if you had acquired Corsairs, but you don't have it. And then you're tricking America into wasting their time trying to attack Dern to stop some non-existent Corsairs. That all becomes really interesting. Now, of course, the problem with that is that it could actually be quite stronger. You could get as many as four Corsairs from this. But like the Americans would have to sort of let the Tripoli do that. And again, if they're doing that, it means they're spending actions sending troops to Benghazi and Dern, which is already a bad move. And so it actually buffs these cards, which I think is good. But it buffs the cards while adding more strategy to the game, not removing it, which I think would be cool. The other idea I had was just you add some simple cost to it, like place two Corsairs in the harbor of Tripoli. Next turn, you may not produce Corsairs. So it's like you bring in the harvest this turn. You're not going to get a harvest next turn. You have to do something else. And so it just forces you to plan ahead. So it isn't an auto play. It's the auto play nature of this that I don't like. Okay. Philadelphia runs aground. One of the more iconic events in the entire war. Big deal. Very interesting. Honestly, I like the card. Yeah. Art is a little busy, but it's called the Philadelphia Runs Aground. And yeah, all of the effects are good. Here's what I would change, though. The difference between 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 is so big. 1 and 2 is basically nothing, as we talked about with U.S. supplies run low. Moving a boat back to Malta, it does literally nothing. It helps the Americans more than it helps Tripoli. So I would change this to minor damage, move an American to the next year of the track. That seems like if we're going for the scale of taken and captured, or just sunk, or just damaged, the next thing after sunk is damaged. It's on the next year of the track. That at least provides some value, and that will make it so that Tripoli players feel less like they have to play Uncharted Waters. And I'm going to get to Uncharted Waters and I'm going to talk about it. Okay. All the Declare War cards are good. I love them. I love how they're designed. It's a little weird that these two show guys being like, hey, here's this guy. And he's like, hey, guys, we're going to war with America. And they're like, yeah. And this is sort of, I guess, them partying afterwards. And this is just a picture of boats. I just wish it was more consistent so that at a glance you can be like, oh, yeah, this is a Declare War card because it's the one where it shows the guy declaring war. That's the only thing I would change. Honestly, it's fine. Okay. U.S. signal books overboard. So, I have researched the Barbary Wars quite a bit. I have read entire pages on Wikipedia on this, and also I've read several books by several different authors and some such stuff. I have not found a moment that this is referencing. If it happens, and it is a thing that happened in history, more power to you. Don't change anything. I don't know when this happened. When they lost signal books and that had a significant impact on the United States' ability to do stuff. I guess it's something that could have happened. But you don't need to add a theoretical here because what this card is representing and what it really should be representing is the fact that America's communication lines were a lot weaker than Tripoli's. because America had to communicate by just sending a boat, and maybe the boat would get lost or caught in a storm, or boat travel was not as consistent as like, hey, get on this camel and then go to Dern and tell the people this. That's a lot more consistent. And so this is sort of trying to represent that fact that America had limited communication lines. I love that. I love the effect. Oh, really well done. And I like that it's an interception roll. But I would just call this like cut supply line, cut communication lines, or intercepted message, or courier gets delayed, or something. Unless this event actually happened, in which case do it. The only thing I would change about this would be a slight change to the rules. I would say this is a really great card, and I wish there was a little more counterplay to it. So the only thing I would change is that I would make interception rolls optional. An American player would not have to intercept if they did not want to. I'd have to check the rules to see if that's possible. On the app, I believe it is. You have to intercept. And so I think it would be interesting if the Americans had the option to be like, oh, we're not going to intercept. We're going to retain our communication lines and have my guys focus on making sure our communications are good, as opposed to trying to go out there and fight. And that's sort of what it represents. And then it's like, dang it, I wanted to play U.S. signal books overboard. And so the Americans may choose not to intercept because it's like, oh, I really don't want to lose the treaty because then I'd have to wait a whole nother year. Or maybe it's the final turn and it's like, oh, I really can't afford to intercept because if I lose the treaty, I can't win. And then it involves a lot of bluffing. So that's the only thing I would change about this card, and it's more the mechanics. Okay, Uncharted Waters. So that's a picture of water. And there's the water. I mean, it's presumably that water is uncharted. That's fine, I guess. I wish this card was called like Uncharted Reef, and then you showed a picture of a reef, or Uncharted Water, and you showed a picture of a shipwreck. It's just kind of weird to have a card be a picture of water. Oh, this is fine. The U.S. signal book's overboard. I mean, I guess. But yeah, it's different than the other cards, but yeah, not a fan. Okay, so as for the effect, this card should be like Stephen Decatur. There should be two cards that this card can be played on, and you have to make a choice of which one, because currently there is no choice. You never play Philadelphia Runs Aground until Uncharted Waters is drawn. And then you play it basically as soon as you can with Uncharted Waters to get the frigate. Maybe you wait to be tricky, but that's having to do with Philadelphia Runs Aground, not with Uncharted Waters. You could wait, and then maybe they discard one of the cards that could sink the Philadelphia. But because this card can only be used on the Philadelphia, you always wait. And then this is the bigger deal. Because this 5 and 6 result is so importantly good, which is why I think my other idea of you don't get Stephen Decatur until, or not Stephen Decatur, Bainbridge. You don't get Bainbridge unless the 5 and 6 is rolled. But in the current game, because this is such a swing, you have to play Uncharted Water, and there's no question. And it's almost like the game is insulting you by giving you the option to play this without Uncharted Water. And it's always a newbie trap. And every new player, I'm always like, do not play Philadelphia Runs Aground until you get Uncharted Water. Don't do it. And it just, that's bad design. So there should be another card that this can be used on. I'm not saying it should be as good as the effect for Philadelphia Runs Aground. I still think 80 or 90% of the time you should use Uncharted Water for Philadelphia Runs Aground. But there should at least be an option, so there's at least a choice, so at least cognitive things are happening in your brain to where people are having to be like, should I use Uncharted Water or should I not? So what should it be used for? And it should be used for storms. Because that works. And I still think it should be called Uncharted Reef, but even if you call it Uncharted Water, it makes sense for storms. But how does it work for storms? Storms doesn't work the same way this does. Well, I would change the effect slightly, but not actually. I would change the text to playable if the Philadelphia Runs Aground or Storms is the active event card this turn. You may re-roll any of your dice and choose the preferred result. So, for Philadelphia Runs Aground, you roll, you get a 4. You may re-roll, and if you get a 2, you may choose the preferred result, which is the 4. For storms, if you are rolling 6 dice, you roll 6 dice. You got 2 6s. You re-roll the 4 and roll again. Is that worth it and better than Philadelphia runs aground? Maybe not, but then maybe is the point there. Maybe it is. Maybe you're like, man, he's just gonna sink the Philadelphia if I get it. Maybe I should save Uncharted Water to try to just nuke a bunch of his ships all at once at the beginning of a turn so I can do a bunch of piracy. Maybe I shouldn't use it on Philadelphia runs aground. And that's interesting. That becomes this interesting choice, and choices are the currency of good gameplay. And I really think that's how this card should be changed. Okay, Merchant Ship Converted. So, thematically, very good card. This is something the Corsairs did. They stole ships, and it was a thing that they did, and a lot of their ships were stolen ships. I like that the card is representing that. Here's the problem, and I guess the art is fine. I still wish it showed a ship connected to another ship. These two are so similar. Here's the problem with this card. You literally never want to not play this card. There is zero cost to playing this card, and zero risk to playing this card. It's not like you play this card before you try to break a blockade, and then after you break the blockade, you play it and get a boat. And even then, it's still, I guess, yeah, it's after it's been successful. I mean, if anything, it should be play before an interception roll. If after this attempted raid you're successful, you get a boat. I mean, that would make it worse. But the point is, it's an auto play, and Happy Hunting is the same way. Happy Hunting is an auto play. So what would I do? How would I fix this? And it brings me back to what I was saying. This game should be referencing real people that did things. So I look at this card and I'm like, okay, what does this card do? Well, it gets you more boats, which is fine. It's cool that there's a card that represents being able to surprise get more boats. I mean, there's Tripoli acquires Corsairs, and there's this for getting more boats. That's good. It's good design. It's good design to have things that make it so the Americans aren't sure how many boats the Tripolitanians have. But there's no counterplay to this, and there's no thought involved in playing this card that makes it a bad card. So how would I change it? Well, I would rename this card and re-theme this card, and I would call it Rais Mohet Rus Feigns Surrender. So, for those of you who don't know, and don't know everything about Tripoli, one of the first battle, in fact the basically first battle of the war, was a fight between the Tripoli, which was captained by the guy whose name I just said, and will not repeat because I don't know how to say words good, and I believe Preble, who was on the other boat. And in that battle was this big, long, epic battle. And during that battle, very famously, the Tripolitan captain feigned surrender not once, not twice, but 3 times. And if something like that happens that many times, I feel like there should be a battle card representing feigning surrender. And so what I think the card does is this is just a complete change of this card, is you do it after a successful interception roll. Roll a dice for every destroyed Corsair. On a 4 or better, the Corsair is not destroyed. So it makes it variable, which means you could get nothing out of this card, which in a sense makes it worse than Merchant Ship Converted. You could get a lot out of it, but more importantly, and this is where things get really interesting, it makes it where you have to sort of choose when you want to play it. You just had 2 Corsairs sunk. Do you want to play this card? Or do you want to hold on to it and wait until maybe you have 4 Corsairs sunk and you have a better chance of saving one? Or do you want to play it now and hope to get those Corsairs early? And that becomes an interesting choice. When do you want to feign surrender? And it mentions an actual guy who was an actual captain, and that seems good to me. I mean, America has so many of these captains who did all of these things and were named these things and that were notable. Well, this guy was a captain. I mean, he didn't win his battle, but he did something that was certainly notable, where he feigned surrender 3 times. And then finally, after the 3rd time, the Americans were like, no, we aren't following. Fool me 3 times, shame on you. And they just basically shot the boat to smithereens. And then when everyone was dead or wounded, it's like, all right, now we'll accept your surrender. And so, yeah. And so basically the idea is that in real life, the Tripoli played feign surrender. And they failed on all of their rolls, and America won anyway. But I, it, even though Merchant Ship Converted is very thematic, I think it's more thematic to have a card like that and more strategic. So that's how I would change it. Don't necessarily have to change the art, although it would be cool to have art of like he's pulling down the flag and then he has like a gun behind his back or something, something to show that he's feigning surrender. Okay, Happy Hunting, one of the worst cards. Not in terms of, well, yeah, it's a good card to draw because there's no thought involved. When doing a pirate raid, you roll 3 dice. Why are you rolling 3 additional dice? What is happening that is making you roll additional dice? Now, if Happy Hunting is some phrase in Tripolitanian that means something specific, then I take it all back. Well, I'm going to take it all back in terms of theme. But right now, when I look at this card, I have no idea what this represents. This literally is just a card that means pirate good. Pirate better. Do piracy, but better this time. It's the same problem with naval movement. It's the same problem with Tripoli acquires Corsairs. It's poorly named. I mean, at least with Merchant Ship Converted, it was thematic and represented something and was well named. Happy Hunting, and again, with Merchant Ship Converted, the change idea I had effectively will have the same idea where you're getting more Corsair. You basically are getting more Corsairs. And with Happy Hunting, we want to have a similar idea if we're going to change this card. Okay, so this is a card that adds an unknown. It's an unknown that makes a raid better. The idea behind that card is good. There's design space for a good card there. You don't want America to be like, oh, we know that they'll only be able to roll this many dice. Happy Hunting should be like a surprise. We're rolling this many dice. But because it's a static 3, you basically always... No, not basically. You want to play this card as soon as possible, no thought required. And that's not good design. So how would I change this card? Well, first of all, I'd change the name. And there's a few different things that you could do with this card. But the idea that I like, and this actually also fixes another quote-unquote problem in the game, of there being no difference between Malta and Gibraltar. And what I would rename this card is Cut Supply Lines, or Intercept Supplies. And what it is playable when making a pirate raid with a Tripolitan Corsair. Roll an extra dice for every boat in Malta. And that, I think, is very interesting, because it changes the dynamic of assault and defend for the Americans. When they assault, those guys have to go back to Malta, and then you risk Happy Hunting. Now, if it's only 2 boats, and again, that includes gunboats. So this is also a nerf to gunboats, which I think actually might be a little justified, not because I believe that fake news video that said that gunboats are overpowered. I don't think they're overpowered. I think they're a little strong, and I think a nerf would not... I think a nerf wouldn't be out of order. And it's only a slight one. And again, it becomes this interesting thing of like, when do I want to hold on to it? How long do I want to hold on to it? Is this the most boats that are going to be in Malta right now? Maybe later a whole bunch will go into Malta. And the American has to think about that. It's like, oh man, Cut Supply Lines has not come out yet. Do I really want to keep all my guys in Malta? And it's sort of representing the fact that if the boats are in Malta getting resupplied, they're not out there patrolling. They're not out there protecting ships that are going about. They're just sitting there, and ships are potentially having to sent there to supply, or they're having to be sent to supply. And that represents a weaker system that is easier to raid, is basically what I'm trying to want to have this card represent. That when the Americans are not out there attacking Tripoli, their boats are more vulnerable, and that's what Cut Supply Lines would represent, or intercept supplies. And maybe you would want to put a cap on this, like maybe you'd cap it at 4 or 5 if you were afraid of it going crazy. But yeah, I think that makes it interesting. It makes it this choice of when do I play it? Do I try to go for more? Do I try to go for less? And America can play around it, and it makes Malta feel like a thing. And if you don't change this card, it actually makes this card a little better, which I think is good. I mean, it doesn't. Even with adding this change, I still would never play this card via the effect, but I guess it's a little better. Okay, Guns of Tripoli. This is good. I like it. There is a tendency to only save this for the Battle of Tripoli, And I'm not saying it shouldn't be, but I like it when cards are used more variably. So the only thing that maybe I would change, and part of this has to do with what I was thinking about with Dern and Benghazi, where they could roll an extra dice. And so maybe if you didn't add that, where they get an extra dice for every two guys there, for Guns of Tripoli, I would consider having it so you could use Guns of Tripoli on on Dern or Benghazi. Like you I would still use it on Tripoli, most likely, because you're getting more dice and you're more likely to actually sink something. But I think the risk of this is can be interesting. It makes it so it's less of a, oh, I'll just attack for no reason to Dern. There's very little cost to this. My point is there's so little cost to bombarding Dern every turn with like a boat and then your gunboats that there should be at least a little bit of a risk. Would I play Guns of Tripoli if I was attacked by a frigate and a single gunboat? Probably not, actually. I probably wouldn't. But giving the option, I think at least makes it slightly more interesting. But I do love it. I love how it's designed. I certainly don't think it should be used with with Tripoli attacks. That would be way too strong. And it also doesn't make really thematic sense. So yeah, Mercenaries Dessert. This is good. The image should be changed to showing them all eating ice cream and cookies. But I'm sure that was just a mess up, and they'll fix that. In terms of the effect of Mercenaries Dessert, here's the problem with it. You get 5 Arab infantry. So, on average, maybe you'll get a guy, but most of the time you won't get any from this. Which makes it seem like a bad card, and makes it seem like you don't want to hold on to it. Which is fine. It's one of the only cards that can be used to help you in combat, but it just seems like it's very swingy. So you have to be very careful when you're buffing this card, because you could roll this and get something ridiculous and just kill a whole bunch of Arab infantry. The way I would buff it is I would just slightly tweak this. Because the problem with this card is playing it and not getting any value out of it. And that happens more often than not. And so what I would do, and also this sort of makes recruit Bedouins bad, because it's like the more Bedouins you can recruit, the more dice are going to be rolled. So it almost feels like you don't want to play this until you can bait out Mercenaries Dessert, which I guess is kind of an interesting interplay, but it just sort of feels like this card should have less downside. It should be less swingy. And so what I would do to change this is I would say, playable at the start of a land battle before the battle starts, roll a die for each Arab infantry. For each 6, take an Arab infantry unit and return it to the supply. If no 6s were rolled, remove 1 Arab infantry and gain 1 Tripolitanian infantry. So that becomes really interesting, because the idea is if it's a huge army of Arabs, what's the chances that they're going to desert? I mean, I don't think as much as if it's just a few Arabs and they're like, oh snap, we actually might lose this. We should probably bug out. Then they might desert. And then it's like, well, maybe I'll try to fight for the winning side. So if you roll a single 6, that's kind of the worst result. And so if it's very few dice that are being rolled, and you roll no 6s, but again, you have to sort of set up for that. You have to hope that you kill a bunch of Arabs in the first fight, which you're less likely to do if you play this for the effect. So it's not that big of a buff. Because most likely, I mean, you're going to get a 6, and so it won't do anything. But if you get no 6s, then it's like, oh, hey, I got a guy. It sort of becomes a 2. It makes the deviation of possible results flatter. And I think that would make it better. I'm not going to talk about these because these are for the solo player game. But yeah, those are my thoughts on all of the cards. Again, designer, if you like any of the ideas, please feel free to incorporate any or all of them, or we can have them as variants on the Rally the Troops site. I really like this game. I really like the cards, and that's why I'm critiquing it. I critique because I love. This is a really well-designed game, and I love cards in general, and I wish that more games had better designed cards. And this game has some really good designed cards. And I just want to help. And I also want you all to have Godspeed.